Yeah, I was sitting in the seat with the harnesses on, not tight, just, you know, hanging out. Kind of made like a floor to see how my feet felt, because the tubes seem to be getting closer and closer, so that's basically my foot room right there. I might gain a little bit on the right, I don't know, this is just kind of everything here is rough setup right now, even the front subframe. Just trying to figure out how I'm gonna make all this stuff work. What I plan on doing is running the pickup points for the rear control arm, the pickup points for the lower control arm. The rear is gonna basically be integrated into the frame. That's the stock piece sitting against the wall right there. And the way that thing mounted, it got all into the, it's just big and bulky, and I'm gonna revise it and use the frame to hold the rear section of the lower control arms, and then use the subframe to hold the front section. You're wondering why I got all that steel on the cross member. It's basically because the cross member is sitting on a couple of pieces of channel and some other stuff to shim it up to rough height. So when you turn the wheel, or you try to lift the wheel or do anything to change anything, usually just lifts the subframe up because it's so light. So put a little bit of weight on it. That tends to hold it in place. Still, it moves a little bit, but it doesn't do too bad. So next is just figuring out. I'm pretty sure at the end of this bar there's going to be a cross brace that runs over to the other side, and then this center section right here will get cut out because obviously the engine and transmission have to run through there. What else? Yeah, so as you can see, that's the front right there. Probably going to end up having to go with a pedal box down here. Because with a pedal box, the pedals will go this way instead of with your swing down. They push back and go this way. So, floor-mounted pedal box. Next thing is kind of temporarily maybe tack welding some stuff to bolt to the subframe to hold it in place, so I can drop the engine on this and see what it's going to have to be cut and figure out where the new tranny mount is going to go. Because what I would like to do is get this mount on both sides made with the cross brace before I cut this center piece out. Just because, like I said before, I can bolt steel to it to keep everything flat and flush. But it'd be nice to have a brace across there before I actually cut it out. So we'll see how that goes. That is full lock with the steering. So I will still have a room to bring the floor pan, or the floorboard out and come around the tire right here. So that will ultimately give me just a little more leg room. So it's going to be cramped now, but yeah, that's full lock right there. So I got plenty of room to go wider with the wheels in. I don't know if I want to go any further out because these are already, I'm pretty sure with this track width in the front, with the Toyota front subframe and the Nissan rear, the Nissan, it's a little bit narrower in the rear, so I wanted to run a square setup with wheels, but it might end up being a staggered setup. So we'll see. Once everything gets kind of closer to being together, I can measure it and figure out what the actual difference is in this. Set the tram gauge up to really get the wheelbase set on this thing so I can see exactly where it's got to go. The wheelbase for the Nissan hardbody, I think I've said this before, is 104.3 inches, which is just about 8'8" and 5/16. 5/16 I think is 100th over, because 5/16 is 0.3125, so 0.30 and 0.31 is close enough for me. But what I need to do now is, if you can see, that pointer is just a hair forward of the wheel. But now what you need to do is you need to make sure that your wheel is perpendicular to the chassis, or perpendicular, if the wheel is parallel to the chassis. And the easiest way to do that on this is, I know that this upper control arm bolt, I know this runs, these two upper control arm bolts run parallel with each other. They're not in, out, anything like that. They're just tweaked up. So basically what you can do is you can measure off your wheel to the center of the bolt on the front and the back and see if the wheel is parallel to the chassis. Which I checked this earlier just to get it close. It's 5 1/4 to the inside of the level. So that's close enough. And now the next thing you need to do is check the subframe to this bar, because I know this bar is perfectly perpendicular to the chassis. So the next thing you'll want to do is find points on the subframe, measure back to a reference mark you have, and then work from there, because if this is off, you'll tweak this, then you'll have to come back out and check and make sure your pointer is still in the center of your wheel. If it's not, you have to make necessary adjustments, recheck the wheel, make sure it's parallel with the chassis. You might have to do this probably 2 or 3 times. If you have to move this forward or backward, you'll have to tweak the wheel a little bit, take your measurements, do all that stuff. But once that's set up, write all these measurements down. That way next time when you do this, I won't have to break the tram gauge out. I have center points set up on the chassis, so I can just shoot my laser straight down, center the subframe, and then take 2 measurements, do it this way, and then we're golden. I don't have to screw with the wheels or anything like that. So that's kind of getting stuff squared up on the chassis. And actually what happened is, where I originally had the subframe at, it has moved forward, I think 3/4 of an inch. So that's great, because that just gives me more foot room up here. So now I will double check all this stuff, make sure this thing's parallel, and then move on to the next thing. So I figured out my measurement. I'm going from the machined flat, right where the control arm bolt mounts in the front, to the front of my main bar here in the front. It's good to go from a machined area on anything, because you know if the thing was put in a jig and machined at the factory that both points on either side are going to be pretty damn close to exactly the same. So now that I've done that, I got the measurement. Now I can put the tram gauge away and pull the front suspension, the upper and lower control arms, wheels, steering rack, everything off this thing, because I know where it has to sit now. And then I can start working on the mounts, the extension of the frame, whatever you want to call it, to get this thing finally located. But I think to finalize it, it's going to have crossbar or bars, support bars, because the A-pillar hoop is going to be here, the A-pillar bar that comes down the window and then ties into the frame rail right here. And then there's probably going to be support bars that come off and come down into the front that are going to catch suspension in here. I haven't decided if I'm going to run the 2x3 out and then come up and catch the 2 mounting points here to mount the subframe, or if I'm going to come off the frame with the 1 5/8 and come up and catch it. I don't know yet. I'm still figuring that out, but we'll see. Well, sometimes progress goes backwards. If you remember before, I don't know if I put it in the video, but I was not going to use this because when I originally set this up, this was going to get into this, and it was going to involve cutting this off and doing some stuff to this, but I was just staring at it and I said, hey, I wonder if that'll, and I threw it on there and it clears everything, because the only thing I'm worried about is, without having the cab on this, seeing where the universal joint for the steering shaft is going to come up and then head up the steering column. And if I come up with, you know, like a steel in here to catch this, I might have this universal joint might run right through the frame that comes up, whereas if I made a bracket to mount this here and then came from the outside up and over to catch the subframe, this would all be clear for that. Also, the exhaust on the other side could have possibly been an issue. So, I don't know. We'll see where we go with this. This would just save so much time. If I could just make a mount that would make this work, then I wouldn't have to cut mounts for the control arm and figure all that stuff out. It would literally be center this up, get my measurements good, and then tack some stuff in here, make some brackets, and get this up, and the front end would basically be located, and the only thing left would be to trim these guys out and build the hoop for the transmission. But like I said, I need to get this thing somewhat temporarily mounted and trim these out and put the engine in here to figure out where all this stuff's going to fit and what else I have to cut out of it. So that's probably for this weekend. Well, not too much more with the front's going to happen now, because there's just too many variables with this thing, as far as there's just too many things I got to figure out with the steering column, and to make the A-pillar bar is going to come off of here, and then there's going to be a dash bar, obviously, and a lot of stuff is going to come off that bar and go down and tie into the front end. So without that stuff on, it's not going to do me any good. I mean, I might be able to make the mounts for that down there, but oh well. Gonna fall back again to the back, start making the mounts for the fuel cell, get that mounted in. I picked up all my tube end nuts today for the fuel lines and vent lines and return lines, stuff like that, so I can start playing with that stuff. I picked up, what else did I get? No, I got my rod ends. Don't necessarily need adjustable traction bars right now, but I figured to hell with it. I got the stuff. The only problem was the steel store was closed today, so I couldn't go pick up the tube I needed, so that'll be next week, put those together. And then, yeah, get the cab back on it, make some reference marks on the chassis of exactly where the cab is at, get some roof line measurements, and pretty much start the cage portion of it. I'll put the rear hoop in, and I'll probably make the two A-pillar bars that run down to the front, because like I said, once those are tied in, then I can start bringing points off this to come in here, points off the top to come down for the suspension to tie into in the front, all that good stuff. It would be totally awesome if I had a 3D scanner, could scan this in and do all that fancy stuff some of those guys do, but still do it the old way, which isn't bad. I got to relocate the fuel filter somewhere back here. I'll probably mount it up in this vicinity. I got some bulkheads, so what I'll probably end up doing is making a bulkhead mount somewhere in here for the feed and return lines, so they can basically get broken here and broken at the tank, taken out, because they'll be hard lines. That way, if the fuel cell ever needs to come out, it's accessible. I don't know. I might hardline them all the way up to the front. I might not. I don't know. I got 25 foot of hardline. I got my flare tool coming. I just need a set of benders. So hopefully, next episode will be putting some of that stuff together. Maybe going over some tube bending basics. It's not really rocket science, but hey, if you've never done it before, it helps to watch a few videos and get yourself familiar with it before you start screwing stuff up.